Hi, and welcome to this Business Talk series of webinars throughout the COVID-19 times. Today's Business Talk is around Can Process Make My Business More Resilient? I'm delighted to be joined by two people today. First of all, Nigel Williams, who's a reader in project management. Nigel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dr. Nigel Williams, reader in project management, University of Portsmouth. I co-lead the responsible project management group, as well as I'm the research lead for the operations and systems management group. And we look a lot at processes and operations in industry across healthcare, logistics, food, oil and gas, and so on.
Thank you, Nigel. And I'm also delighted to have with us today from industry, Craig Willis, who's the operations director at SCORE. Craig, would you like to introduce yourself?
As I said, Craig Willis. I'm currently the operations director at SCORE. We're a process improvement software platform, and I've been working in the industry for about 20 years across all sorts of different sectors, including oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, banking. Work with organizations from small startups right through to global enterprises.
Okay, thank you, Craig. So without further ado, I think we're going to jump straight into some of the questions that have been sent in by people interested in hearing your thoughts. But before we get down to that and sort of setting the scene really in terms of process, I'm sure we can all think of fantastic examples in these times, particularly in these lockdown times when businesses perhaps operating in retail have had to move to online, or when businesses that perhaps provide face-to-face services have had to find new and interesting ways to do that so they can keep running. But before we get into all of that and some great examples and thinking, I think we should probably have a little bit of a talk about what we mean by process. And I think in the first instance, if we could perhaps come to you, Nigel, and say, what is process?
All right. Well, processes are invisible but important. Now, a formal definition would be a sequence of tasks or activities that are organized in a way to produce some sort of valuable output. Could be a product, service, or an experience if you are in the entertainment type industries. Now, there are multiple ways of classifying them. One way that's generally used in operations management is in terms of from continuous to one-off processes. And that span would fit in your mass production, your mass services like your McDonald's, your one-off things like or repeated processes like hairdressers, and your one-offs like projects. And while we may think of projects as being something external to the organization, research suggests that 40% of organization activity is project-based.
Okay, thanks very much, Nigel. And so, Craig, coming to you from your perspective, working in the business community, where do you see the most demand for process or types of process?
Well, echoing what Nigel said there, all work that happens within an organization is part of a process. The activities and tasks that people do to deliver some sort of output. So, that could be fulfilling a customer order, hiring a new employee, processing an invoice. Everything that happens is a process, whether we recognize it as that or not.
That's quite right.
I think more specifically what we tend to be talking about when we use the word process is actually the documentation of processes, and that might be procedural text-based documentation, but more commonly it's flow charting, so visualization of the steps in a process and who's doing them and what are the systems and how do they interact with each other.
Okay, and when you say systems, we're presumably not just talking about IT systems, but any form of system.
Ooh, well, that's a big question. An organization itself is a system, right, of different interlocking parts. But when I use the term system, predominantly I'm talking about software systems, whether it's a customer relationship management, a HR system, or whatever. What we always try to understand is we've got people doing work. So the work is the process. And then we want systems to make that work easier, faster, better. And so we need to understand how they interact with each other.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks very much. So I think that's quite good and leads nicely on to the next question, which is in our list from the people who've talked in, which is all about the value of process and the value of reviewing the process and what kind of impact it has. And this person has said, why is it important to review my processes? I've managed okay up to date, but what impact could it have on my bottom line? So I suppose the question they're really asking is process review, looking at good process, what's the value, what's the impact? And in the first instance, I'm going to come to Nigel with that question.
Sure. Well, a lot of organizational activity and a lot of organizational capabilities, another buzzword, is poorly understood because it's based on a tacit set of knowledge and it's based on interactions among people. What we try to do in documenting process is to make that explicit so it can be understood and it can be improved. And if you want to embed it in a larger framework, like let's say a maturity model, the base of any organizational improvement is understanding what you do and how you do what you do, documenting that and thinking of ways in which you can improve it. So it forms to date, you may have done quite well, but you may not understand why you've done so well. And if your competitor understands what you do better than you do, you won't have a business for much longer.
Okay, so that's a nice way to put it, actually. You won't have business much longer if your competitors understand your processes better than you. Craig, practically speaking, is this something you come across a lot where people are asking you to help them review their processes but then also wanting it justified in terms of impact?
Certainly, it's quite common for organizations to try to understand the value that they're going to get from investing in this type of activity. I think we see larger organizations tend to do this as a matter of course, but small to mid-sized businesses, it's not always something that they're familiar with. The thing that I always say to businesses, the value that they're going to get from this is there's three things, really, three core things that they're going to get out of it. I talk about alignment, opportunity, and constraints. And by alignment, I mean, and Nigel talked about this just now, about how it sometimes documenting a process is about formalizing how something happens or agreeing how it happens. And it's amazing how many organizations we see where there isn't alignment among the team. People are trying to achieve the same thing but do it in different ways, maybe not always the best way. So going through the exercise of creating that documentation actually is incredibly powerful at getting teams aligned. And then as a result of that, people talking about what they're doing and identifying different ways of doing it from their colleagues, they identify opportunities for improving it. But they also need to understand the constraints that are inherent in a process. What's going to stop us from realizing some of those opportunities? And I think the constraint piece is important because it often gets forgotten. But an example of a constraint might be some sort of legal requirement that you have to fulfill as an organization. You could do this faster, better if you removed this step, but you might be breaking the law as a result of that. So those are the three things that that's the sort of value that you're trying to get out of doing this type of work.
Okay, so let's assume that an SME or a similar sort of organization is watching today and they're thinking about going through that process of, as you say, looking at their alignment, looking at their opportunity, and taking into consideration their constraints. One of the questions we've been asked today is, can I do this, or should I be using a ready-made solution? So I suppose coming to Craig first, because it's probably in the sort of practical world, and I'm guessing it's a question you get asked, or perhaps you develop bits of software for. Is there an off-the-shelf? Should people go for a particular solution?
There's lots of solutions available. Obviously, we provide a solution, and our solution, a score solution, is about making process easy for as many people as possible. But I like to think of it as that process is kind of like the consulting industry's dirty little secret. It often comes across as being quite complex and requiring quite a lot of effort, and it doesn't really at all. As I said, we provide a platform that makes it easy. Or you could invest in something that's highly complicated, it's very kind of powerful in terms of looking at the architecture of a huge enterprise. But actually, that's not really always what you need. And in fact, it could be as simple as just getting a piece of paper and a pen, right? There is huge amount of value in smaller organizations sitting together as a group, piece of paper, like, let's just sketch out what the key steps are. You will undoubtedly find things that you can improve in your process through a simple 30-minute or 60-minute conversation about how stuff happens.
And so, yeah, taking that same question to you, Nigel, perhaps maybe not necessarily about solutions that you can buy, but following on from what Craig had to say, what kind of solutions would you recommend?
Well, again, it depends on the organization and depends on the nature of working. Because if you're an organization that's smaller, a bit more agile, a bit less regulated, you can work with pencil, paper, whiteboards, a tool that's quite flexible and quite open. If you're in a larger and more complicated industry, you probably do need a consultant there, if only as a critical friend to connect you to best practices somewhere else. And you would want to adopt a formal tool like SCORE to begin that mapping process. I've worked with companies at a range of sizes, SMEs, and sometimes they trip up on process in other organization improvement initiatives. So in improving health and safety, for example, they realize we need to map our processes because we don't know what's safe and what's not safe. In risk interventions, same thing. ISO 9000 quality things, responding to regulations. They've realized they don't understand what they do in this space exactly. They can't report it to a regulator, so they've got to document their processes.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. So then the next question really is probably quite pertinent to the times that we currently live in. And we had a webinar a few weeks back that was, I think, 2 weeks back, that was all about workplace and personal resilience. And I think resilience is something that's been on the business agenda for a long time, particularly in academia, but perhaps it's becoming more important, more to the fore for businesses operating in the current environment. And so asking the question, can process make our business more resilient, or is it just about getting the sales in? So I suppose there's a loaded question there in terms of, is process about getting more money to the door and getting more sales, or is there a way that process can be used perhaps to help people deal with knocks and blows in the future and become more resilient? So come back to Nigel initially for this one, I think.
Sure. Well, in terms of resilience, we're thinking about being able to anticipate and respond to the future. So you want the organization to build processes or capabilities either on envisioned scenarios or for the future unknown unknowns, if you want to use that terminology from the early 2000s. And in that case, you will have to think of the anticipated, and something like COVID-19 sadly was anticipated, and the even stranger unanticipated. And it depends on how much flexibility you want to build in, because side note, a lot of organizations who've put in very lean systems are in trouble now because they're lean, but they're brittle. They're not able to respond to the demands of the time. So you would find that going forward, organizations are going to have a mixing of philosophies where there's a state in which you operate on a lean basis where you want to keep the costs down and get the sales in, and there's a state where you want to be responsive and resilient, where should the unanticipated happen, we can still provide some level of service or meet our existing commitments.
Okay, and so Craig, similar perspective, but in industry, the same question is, do your solutions often look to add resilience, or do any of what Nigel just said?
Yeah, I like the comment about the brittleness that you can create by over-optimizing a process. That's certainly very true. And I'd argue the same thing. Resilience is about innovation and agility, about being able to adapt quickly to changes, but also taking advantage of new opportunities quickly. And when we've seen that certainly in the current crisis, where you think of some organizations that have been used to selling food in a fixed physical location, and then all of a sudden there were some very innovative businesses that were able to almost overnight transform to a takeaway or delivery service where they hadn't traditionally done that. Now that hasn't worked out for everybody, but they've been able to make those changes quite quickly. I think that the point about sales is an interesting one. I think if you can continue to increase sales, potentially that is a good thing, but there is a danger if you're not keeping track or managing the costs at the same time. You could easily sell yourself into bankruptcy. So just selling more doesn't necessarily make you resilient, right? So you've got to. One of the things that process does really well, and especially if you are looking at it on an ongoing basis, so it's not a one-off exercise to document a process, but you're taking the time regularly to look at that and say, how has the work in the organization deviated from what we documented last time, and what have we learned since we last documented it? Because what you almost want to do is take all of those core processes, all of the repeatable stuff, the stuff you do all of the time. You almost want to get that to a point where you don't really even have to think about it, and give the team, the leadership, everyone in the business a bit more headspace to be able to innovate and deal with unexpected situations as they arise.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. That's a fantastic answer. So I suppose, having thought about those processes and those resilience, and perhaps getting the team together with scraps of paper, or engaging companies such as yourself, one of the questions we've got here is, do I need training in this? Does my team need training in this? So I guess there's an array of answers here, but coming to you first, Craig, as somebody who advises businesses on a regular basis, would you recommend that businesses go into training, or something else?
As you said, it's not a kind of straightforward answer. I think any type of training in this area helps, if you're, again, especially if you're not familiar with it. There's a lot of information available out there, and there's a lot of options. So part of it is maybe taking a bit of time up front to think about exactly what you want. So there's a lot of well-known and well-established approaches and methodologies out there. Nigel mentioned, for example, lean, which comes out of manufacturing, but can be equally applied in many different businesses. But that is there's an enormous body of knowledge around that, and there are training courses, and people can specialize and spend an entire career on that. And so, if you're a small to medium-sized business, is it worth investing in hiring a full-time person who's a lean specialist, or training up a team member? It might not be. It might be worth bringing somebody in for a short period of time. But there are lots of approaches that actually are much simpler. And again, obviously, I talked before about how SCORE. We're all about making processes as easy as possible for people. So of course we provide training around our product, but we also provide a lot of free resources as well through our website, YouTube channels, and so on. So again, I think it's about understanding where you are as an organization. Am I a large enterprise, or am I a small to medium-sized business? Do I have dedicated resource to put on this, or am I trying to do this as part of my job, and other members of my team are trying to do this as part of their job? Because I go back to what I said before. It could be as easy as picking up a piece of paper and a pen, and then Nigel picked up on the fact that actually, okay, you're not then going to have a well-managed process, but sometimes that doesn't matter. It's just about, hey, let's find some quick wins, fix something quickly, and then move on to the next thing. Or anywhere along that spectrum, from that kind of piece of paper up to, okay, we're a business that is complex enough that we are having process problems, and therefore we do need something that's a bit more disciplined, like SCORE. But we're maybe not big enough to have a team of dedicated staff on this. And so it's looking at the options, understanding where you are, and then picking the right one.
Okay, and then coming to Nigel as both a researcher and an educator, what's your view on training for staff within organizations?
Well, of course you should have training as much as possible, and at the University of Portsmouth. But building on that, the issue is not necessarily about training itself. It's because processes are invisible and poorly understood. People ask questions like that because they're trying to think, is this worth my time and money? Is this investment going to bring me anything back? And I read a lot about the difficulties of implementing things like lean and quality management, project management in organizations, because those things aren't sexy. They're invisible. They only get the CEO's attention when they're a problem. If they're working well, nobody cares about them. So one of the aspects you wanted to link to that, by training in process, you're signaling to your employees internally that this is important. We're making a commitment to improve what we do, and that we need to improve what we do. So in addition to all the stuff that Craig had said in terms of how you learn and how you develop and where you start, it also sends a very important signal in the organization that we need to change, and this is one of the pathways we're taking to change.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually, which is often good quality training does exactly that. You're giving an indication that you're willing to let them take time out of the business to learn, and therefore showing that it is of value to what you're doing. So moving on to some questions that are more specific actually, and one of these is around examples. I think this is a nice way to discuss potential process. So somebody's put here, can you give me examples of what processes have made a difference for IT or other businesses? So looking at that industry, and I'll come to Craig first. Any thoughts on good examples that kind of sell the argument?
Well, I can think of hundreds of examples. Nearly every organisation we go into, I can't think of one time where I've been into an organisation to look at a process and we haven't found something that's made a difference in that organisation. Obviously, the magnitude of that improvement changes from project or customer to customer. But if I pick up on IT specifically, there is one. I think this is quite an interesting example of a process that springs to mind from an IT services business. It was actually one of my colleagues was looking at this with a client a while back, and it was the levers process. And by the levers process, I don't mean the employees' levers process, but this was people cancelling their service, so the customers leaving process. And in this particular business, they were having a lot of complaints. So when the customer decided to move on to a different supplier, leaving their existing supplier was quite a challenge, and so they were receiving a lot of complaints about this, and therefore kind of the brand damage, negativity, and so on. So the team sat down and said, "Okay, let's look at this process and let's find out where the bottlenecks are, where the problems are, what is it that's upsetting those customers that are leaving us, and just try and make it as smooth and quick as possible." And very quickly in that conversation, they started to realize that actually what they should be thinking about is, it's actually easier to keep existing clients than it is to win new ones. So rather than making it easier for the clients to leave or making it hard so that they're upset, we should be trying to work out how do we encourage them to actually stay with us. And I think it was a 2-hour session. They sat down to do this, and it was an eye-opening session. It was not something that anyone had kind of thought about before, but just going through that exercise of going, okay, what happens today? What are we doing, and where is it going wrong, and how can we make it better? Brought that type of thinking and that type of innovation out. And so what they started to do actually was the process didn't change a great deal. What they started to do was make offers to the clients and say to them, okay, you're leaving. If we were to offer you this service at a discounted rate for a period of time, would you help us and provide feedback so we can improve other parts of the service which led to you leaving in the first place? So I think that's one example that immediately sprung to mind.
Thanks for that, Craig. And so coming to you, Nigel, maybe are there practical examples or in the literature and such? Have you got examples of where processes have made a difference?
Well, a practical one is I was having a conversation a couple of months back with a large housing trust in the West Midlands, and one of their problems that they were experiencing was that their clients who were renters were leaving and also incurring significant debts. So they were thinking of bringing in a customer churn model that was adopted from the mobile phone industry. It's quite expensive, hundreds of thousands of pounds. But before they did, they sat down and mapped out their processes on pen and paper, not using SCORE, but they should have. And in the process, in the exercise in mapping out their processes, they realized a much cheaper intervention would be educating their customers in money management and providing them with IT training services so they can look up their debt status. And that was the process they chose to implement instead, rather than a customer churn model that tried to predict who would stay and who would go.
Okay, thank you very much. And we've got our final question, actually, which I think is quite a nice question, and I think actually gets to the heart of value. And you talked earlier, Nigel, about if you don't have your processes, and you don't understand what you do and how you do it, your competitors might understand it better than you. And so perhaps in some respects this has been covered. But how can this, so like knowing your process, improving your process, make you stand out from the competition? So I'll just come to Nigel first, that one.
Well, again, it depends on what value you're providing for which set of stakeholders and in what way. So And for many organizations, that itself is not completely well understood in terms of what value they provide. They think they're providing a product or a service, but really value comes from your product and service in use. So it's first understanding your sources of value for which stakeholders, and then how is that different to what competitors are providing. And on that basis, you can then decide, well, where would I focus my effort in terms of improving my processes? So if my value is providing a space for customers to gather, like a lot of pubs and bars do, it's not necessarily alcohol, it's a community, then you want to come up with processes that support and maintain that. If your value is in terms of the knowledge that you provide to customers, or the quality of interactions that you have, then that's the capability that you want to build going forward. And the rest of the stuff you might want to maintain at a particular level, but you don't invest beyond a certain amount. You'd rather focus on the areas that provide this differential value or distinctive value to your stakeholders.
Okay, thank you very much. And then coming to you, Craig, in terms of how does this process review and process evaluation make you stand out from competitors?
Well, I always like to give some examples, some big name examples in this space. There's some organizations that really put process at the heart of everything they do. The one that always comes to mind, first of all, is Apple, right? They're an incredibly innovative company, but they're an incredibly process-driven company, and that's about. I think I mentioned this before. It's about, let's make all of the easy stuff so easy we don't even have to think about it. And that's, looking at those processes and making sure that they get out of the way and they're not preventing us from moving forward. Another one that I like to use is Amazon, right? Amazon, in terms of operational excellence and process optimization, probably the world leader. They take anything in the supply chain and they optimize it beyond all recognition and beyond any competition, which really sets them out. But I think if I'm obviously we're not all Apples and Amazon, so if I'm a business looking at how can I embrace process and use it as a tool to help me stand out from my competition, then I'd say, think about what are you good at today? What are you better at today than your competitors? And look at that and say, is that as optimized as it can be? Can I do more? Can I keep ahead of the competition in that way? It might be, if you're providing a product, it might be that you fulfill that an order faster than your customers. So make sure that you're always faster than your customers. Or if you're fulfilling a product, it might be that it's a better quality than your competitors. So again, looking at that process and ensuring that you're removing any opportunity to reduce quality is going to be important to prevent them from catching up on you. But then you could look at it a different way. You could say, okay, what are my competitors good at doing that I want to be good at or better than them? And then again, that's probably a process that you have today, but you're probably not that good at. So start that, looking at that and say, what can I do to optimize that to at least catch up with the competition? So I think practically that's the sort of thing you should be asking yourself and thinking about.
Okay, thanks, Craig. It's brought us to the end of the questions that we received. I'll do a bit of a recap and come back from some of my notes that I've taken today. So I've certainly learned a lot. Particularly, I'd never thought about before that processes are invisible but important, and can be continuous or one-off. Particularly what you do, how you do it. Organizations, known only by people that haven't mapped their processes, are potentially a bit vulnerable. I particularly liked your three-part, Craig, around alignment, opportunity, and constraint, and sort of looking at how you achieve things and the opportunity that comes from that, and then making sure that you don't fall foul of constraints such as legal constraints. Also, the idea that process is not as complex as you think, and I particularly liked Nigel's point around what do you do and how do you do it, and if you don't understand what you do and how you do it, and one of your competitors does, then you could end up in trouble. The phrase "lean systems can be brittle" is gonna stick with me for a while, I think, because it's an unusual combination of words which makes a lot of sense. But I think training came through quite strong, and the whole point of training be about enabling you in whatever mode to do that, whether it's through a consultant or whether it's through investing in your staff and showing some priority. And actually, the competition bit that we ended in was nice in terms of what's the value, how is it different, and how do I stay ahead of the competition, alongside a lot of other things which are making me think I should go back to my office at the very least, get a very large piece of paper, lots of coloured pens, and at least have an initial go at looking at some of the processes within my own team. I'd like to say a very big thank you to you both for joining us today. So big thank you to Craig Willis from SCORE. If you're interested in what Craig does, his website is not as obvious as you might think. It's getscore.com. And please go ahead and visit there. And I think Craig mentioned that there are a few materials and YouTube videos and channels and things to get you started. Equivalently, a massive thank you to Dr. Nigel Williams today. And if you want to find out more about what the university does, we're also online at port.ac.uk. Thank you both for attending, and thank you all for listening, and we will see you all next week. Thanks very much.